my name is Elle and I'm the cross stitch artist and designer behind Chaos Kittens and Crafting, and welcome back to my cross stitch tutorial series. For this series, this is the sampler pattern that we are working on. And in our last video, we finished up this center column here. Today, we're actually going to be jumping over to the right-hand column, and we're actually going to finish this entire column all in this one video. What we're going to be discussing today is the number of strands that you stitch with and why. So there are different numbers of strands that people prefer to stitch with. Typically, you will see people stitching with either 2 or 3 strands, but there are some scenarios where you might want to stitch with just a single strand, or you might even want to stitch with more strands. So we are actually going to be playing with that today by doing a column where you stitch one block with each of the different numbers. So we're going to be starting at the top with 6 strands in that top block, and all of the blocks going down are going to have one less strand until we get to the bottom block that's only going to be stitched with 1 strand. This should be a pretty quick and easy tutorial today, so let's get started. Our materials for today's video include our pattern, of course, the piece that we are working on. We're going to need just a single color today. I'm choosing to work with black, which is DMC 310. You're going to need your needle and a pair of scissors. To make things a little easier on myself today, I did pre-cut 2 lengths of this black floss. Like I said in some previous videos, I do cut 18-inch lengths of floss to stitch with. So I just pre-cut 2 of them ahead of time because I know that's how many we're going to need to do this section today. We're going to start by stitching this top block on our sampler pattern. So we are going to be skipping a few stitches over our beaded section to get to our right-hand column. And our top block is going to be stitched with all 6 strands of our floss. So that means we are not going to be stripping away any strands of floss. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm just going to tie 1 singular knot in the end here and then thread the other end onto my needle. Because we're working with 6 strands, threading all 6 of them onto your needle might be a little bit difficult. So take your time and just be patient with yourself. It often takes me a few tries to get all 6 to go through the eye of the needle. So if it takes you a moment, just pause the video. It's okay, it's totally normal. Once you have your floss threaded onto your needle, we are going to be counting over to start in the top corner of our block here. So starting from the top right corner of our red block, we're going to be counting over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches to come out in the top left corner of our block here. So starting in the top right-hand corner of our red block, we're going to count 5 stitches over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is where our first stitch is going to come up through. Stitching with 6 strands is definitely going to be a little bit more difficult. It's going to take a little bit more force to push the needle and all of that thread through the fabric. So go slowly, go carefully, take your time with this one. I'm going to be stitching this block using the English method as we go. So as a reminder, the English method means we are finishing each and every stitch before we move on to the next one. We want to be careful as we are doing this top block, and even the one with 5 strands as well, that all of our little strands of floss are lying down as we push our fabric through. So we don't want any little loose pieces of it sticking up funny, making any bumps or loops on the top of our piece. And we also want to make sure the bottom of our piece is not suffering from having any loops or extra tangles or knots of thread on the back. So funny story as we go, the very first piece that I ever did, I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. I got a kit from, I think, Michael's. I got a cross stitching kit. And this was a stamped kit, but they were not like the stamped kits that you see today. It was not wall-to-wall stitched. You just would stitch sort of some embellishments onto a printed piece of fabric. And so the majority of the fabric was covered in some sort of pattern, and then you would sort of embellish it with some cross stitches. But they were printed so poorly that you kind of had to guess where the stitches were supposed to go. And being 9 or 10, I was like, I don't need to follow any of these directions. I know what I'm doing. You're just making X's on the cloth. And I actually stitched with all 6 strands. So I ran out of floss super early. There were knots and tangles everywhere. It was extremely difficult, all because I didn't read the instructions. So my very first piece was, needless to say, a hot mess. So bad I actually had to throw it away. But that's actually why I do think that it's important to do this row where you're stitching with all of the different strands of floss so you can see what these feel like and how to do it properly if you do want to stitch with more strands. So as we are finishing up this particular block, you're gonna see that this block has a 3-dimensional texture to it that stitching with 2 strands in our center column just doesn't have. Those ones lie really flat to the fabric. You run your finger over them and they're raised a tiny bit, but running your finger over this block that we just made with 6 strands, it is much more 3-dimensional. I can actually turn my piece sideways a little and you can see how far it sticks up off of the fabric. So I always tell people, if you want to add a little something extra to your piece and it makes sense to give certain parts of it extra emphasis or texture, if you want it to be something that feels really cool to touch, you actually might want to do some little bits of it with 6 strands. That being said, I do not recommend that you stitch your entire piece with 6 strands unless you are using the really big plastic Ida cloth. So that's going to be the stuff where you would normally be stitching with yarn. If you have plastic Ida that is supposed to be stitched with yarn, you can consider stitching with 6 strands because the holes are so big and they're spaced out so far that the 6 strands are really going to fill it out. But if you're working on traditional cloth Ida or Ida cloth, I don't recommend stitching an entire piece with 6 strands. It's going to be difficult. You're much more prone to tangles and snags. And your piece, it's going to stretch out all of these little holes a lot. All of these center corners here that we did around this center stitch of our piece have 24 strands of floss all going through that one single little hole. And typically when we're stitching with just 2 strands, they only have 8 going through. So this is a lot of thread. Plus you're gonna just eat up your thread. You're gonna go through thread so fast if you're stitching with all 6 of your strands. So with all of those things out of the way, I do want to say it is kind of cool if you do want to play around with texture and play around with some of the things that you're doing in your piece. Absolutely go for it. That's part of what this is all about, is teaching you how and when to do these things. So we're going to tie off on the back of this one and we're going to move down to our next block. I'm going to tie off with a knot on the back here. Just one single knot because there's so many strands here. I really don't need to double knot it. It's not going anywhere. With that, our next block down is actually going to be stitched with 5 strands. So I'm going to strip a single strand off of this. And the easiest way that I found to strip off a single strand is to pull the single off to the side like this. Pinch this really lightly between your fingers, and you're going to pull this single strand out. And as you can see, the rest of the strands bunch up under my fingers as I'm pulling. And then they just fall flat again once I have that single strand out. I am going to save this. We are going to use this again to stitch one of our blocks down below with a loop start. So save this, you're going to need it again. But for now, I'm going to tie another knot for stitching our 5 strand block. And again, the other end of it is just going to get threaded right onto our needle. Now here's where making sure we check our pattern is very important. In our center column, each of our blocks had 2 spaces between them. So over here, looking at our stitched piece, we had 2 rows empty in between all of our blocks. But on our right-hand column, we're doing 6 blocks instead of 5. So there is only 1 space in between each of our blocks, but our top block and our bottom block still line up together. So we want to make sure that we're only leaving 1 stitch of space on this right-hand column as we move forward today. So starting from our bottom left-hand corner, we're just going down a single stitch, and that's where we're going to pull up with our 5 strands. I'm going to stitch this one exactly the same as I just stitched our 6 strand block. So I'm going to do English method, tying off with a knot at the beginning and the end. This should already feel a little bit easier to move the needle and floss through the cloth, partially because you're getting used to stitching with a little bit more floss, and also because this is a little bit less floss than last time. It's just 5 strands instead of 6. So as these blocks go today, as you stitch them, it should feel easier and easier and easier to go. All right, and once again, I am going to tie off just like I did before. Just a single knot, because again, this is a really thick amount of thread. And then we're gonna move on to our block that we're stitching with 4 strands. So once again, I'm going to strip a single strand off of here, separating it, pinching really lightly and pulling that strand out. And now we're left with just 4 strands there. I'm setting that one aside as well. We are going to come back to that one too. This time I think we're going to do the bury the lead method, or the weaving under method, for our stitches. So once again, from our bottom left hand corner, we're just going down a single stitch before we pull up. I'm going to make sure that my tail is sitting nice and flat across the back here. Before I start my stitching, we get our finger out of the way so we don't poke ourselves as we go down. Come back up, make sure we go over our tail for this next stitch. Finger out of the way so we don't poke ourselves as we go back down. Up and over our tail for our next stitch. So I am doing the Danish method on this one because it is a nice clean way to get that tail really nice and tucked under on the back here. Nice and secure. All right, so now we don't have to flip it over anymore because that tail is properly captured under all 3 of those first stitches. And then I will just continue on with the Danish method for the rest of this block. and as we get to the end here, I'm going to weave my tail under some of my stitches that I've made. There we go. And then we're going to snip that off. And I'm actually going to cut the tail from the beginning a little bit shorter. It was a little bit long, and I don't want as much floss kind of floating around on the back of my piece. Now, this is too short for us to do any more stitching with, so we're all done with that bit. So remember at the beginning, I told you that I cut 2 lengths of floss. I also told you to set aside those other pieces. So for right now, we are going to take our second length of floss, and this time we are going to be splitting it with 3 strands in each piece. We're only gonna need 1 of them for this, but splitting it 3 and 3. Gonna undo all of that. Save your extra. You can use it for other stitching. You can use it later in this pattern for some of our other pieces, for some of our other blocks and things that we're going to be working on. But for right now, we're just going to be stitching with our 3 strands. For this one, I think I'm going to do the loop start without a loop method. So as a reminder, we start by threading our needle. So for the loop start without a loop method, this is a reminder as I go. We have our little chart where we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 written down in the order that you stitch your cross. So I'm going to be starting by coming up through the top left, down through the bottom right, up through the top right, and down through the bottom left. So that's my 1, 2, 3, and 4. So as I give these directions, that's what these numbers are referring to. So for the loop start without a loop method, we start on the top of our piece, not the bottom, by going down through number 3. So instead of starting in our top left corner of our block, we're going to shift 1 stitch over and go down through there, down through 3, leaving about a 1-inch tail on the top. I'm going to hold that tail down and come up through number 2. For me, that's down below. For you, it might be somewhere else. Come all the way up. I used my finger to hold that tail down so it doesn't slip through. Then I'm going to go back down through 2 again, leaving a loop on top. I like to stick my finger through the loop so that I don't accidentally pull it onto the bottom. So far we have gone down through 3, leaving a tail, up through 2, then back down through 2, leaving a loop. It should look like this. Next, we're going to come up through 1. This is the start of our actual stitch. We are going to go through our loop and pull it flat. Then we're going to go down through 2 and make sure we pull that loop onto the back of our piece. It should make a tiny little popping sound. I'm going to pause for a moment to cut my tail off here. You can wait and do this later, but I find it's easier to do it at this step of the process. And next we're going to come up through 3 and down through 4, finishing our stitch just like normal. And with that, I can tug on this really, really hard and it's not going, like I'm really tugging on it. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to finish off the rest of this top row with the English method as well, like I did with our first 2 blocks. So I did that top row with the English method. I'm now actually going to switch over to the Danish method for the rest of this block. You can go back and forth between what methods you want to use based on your mood, on what strikes your fancy at the moment. As long as your finished piece has all of the crosses in the right place, do things in the order that makes sense to you or in the way that makes sense to you. So Danish method, you go one direction with half of your crosses, and then you go back over them and finish your crosses going the other direction. And then my third row, I'm also going to do Danish method. I do actually prefer working with the Danish method over the English method for the most part. The tapestry piece I'm working on, I'd use the English method, but that's because the stitches are kind of all over the place. But if I'm working on a piece that has big blocks of color and things like that, I tend to prefer working with the Danish method. That's just personal preference. Everybody is different. And if you prefer doing things in a different way, that's totally fine. That's why I'm teaching you all these different ways to do it, right? That's the whole point. All right, finishing that block off, I'm going to flip it over and we're going to once again weave our ends under. This time we're going from the other direction, and I can only get it under one strand to start because my needle is too close to my hoop. So I'm going to go under one strand and then the next strand because I can't get the angle quite right, and that's okay. If you can only go under 1 or 2 strands at a time, as long as your thread ends up going under between like 3 and 5 stitches on the back of your piece, it's okay to just do 1 or 2 at a time. It's also okay to switch up the directions. So if I felt like, oh, I went under the purple. If I felt like this wasn't secure enough, or if I didn't have enough stitches all in a row, I could turn this around and go back under the next row, or I could go at a diagonal, or I could go vertically. As long as you're weaving under 3 to 5 strands on the back, you should be good. Go in whatever direction makes sense to you. I'm going to snip our little tail off here. All right. So that was our block stitched with 3 strands. We're going to do our block stitched with 2 strands next. So of the 2 pieces that I had you set aside before, we're going to use the longer one. So go ahead and take this. We are going to fold it in half and we are going to do a loop start so that we have 2 strands because this is folded over. So we thread our 2 ends through our needle. The other side should have a loop. Our loop also starts on the top of our piece going down through point number 2. So from our top right, remember we're only skipping 1 stitch going down on these blocks. From our top right, we're going to go down into point 2, up through point 1, through our loop, gently lay it flat, and then back through point 2 again. Just like that. This one I'm going to do full Danish method rather than finishing off that first stitch. If you are doing a loop start without a loop, I do recommend finishing that first stitch fully before moving on. But if you're doing a regular loop start, you can move directly into the Danish method without having to finish off that first stitch if you don't want to. All right, I'm going to weave under one more time. Feel free to use a pin stitch if you want to try that method out again, if you feel like you want a little more practice with that, or you can tie off with a knot if you'd rather do that. Use whatever ending method you prefer. I'm going to snip my thread there. All right, and now we are moving on to our last block. This block should line up perfectly with our pink block, just the way our top block lined up with our red block on the top there. So we are going to take our last little length that I had you guys save. This time, because we only have a single strand, I am definitely going to be tying off with a knot at the beginning and end of this one, but I'm going to be tying with 3 knots instead of my regular 2, just to really make sure that that's with 2. I want to make sure that doesn't pop through one of our little holes as we are stitching. So I'm going to triple knot this one before I thread my needle. Hopefully, stitching has gotten a lot easier as you've been going down this column. So again, I'm starting in this top left corner, just a single stitch down from our previous block, and it should line up perfectly with the top of our pink block over here. So yeah, hopefully you can see you know, how this is getting a lot easier to stitch with these different numbers of strands. And as we're seeing this column come together, we can see how stitching with the different number of pieces of floss is giving us a different look. So at the top, those stitches are really, really full, almost over full when you're stitching with all 6 strands. Getting into 5 and 4 strands, they're still very, very full, but it doesn't look quite so overwhelming. Some people do prefer to stitch with 3 strands on 14 count. The reason that I don't is because I do a lot of patterns with color blending. I actually make a lot of patterns with color blending. And color blending with 3 strands is a little different than color blending with 2 strands. And that's actually going to be the topic of our next video, is color blending. So that is part of why I wanted you guys to do this part first, is so that we know what it feels like and looks like to stitch with these different numbers, and you have a preference already before we get into color blending. So I'm going to finish up this last stitch right here and then tie off on the back with 3 knots. Did I do English method on that last row? I might have without even thinking about it. All right, I think I might have tied off 4 times there. That's fine. It looks good. That is our column for today. So there are definitely some times where you might want to stitch with different numbers of floss. Like I said, traditionally people will stitch with 2 or 3 strands of floss, so these 2 blocks in here, depending on how full they want their piece to look. I've had a lot of people come to me and look at my pieces and they say, I don't understand, you are stitching on 14 count fabric with 2 strands of floss and your stitches look really, really full. But my stitches don't look really full. I can see a lot of gaps in between my stitches, or I see a lot of fabric in between my stitches. What's going on if we're both using 14 count fabric and we're both stitching with 2 strands? And my next question is always, what brand of fabric are you stitching on? Because your brand of fabric does make a difference. So the thing that I have noticed is that I want to say every single person that's come to me with that question has been stitching on loops and threads fabric. The loops and threads fabric from Michaels does have a place. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the fabric itself, but it is made with a much looser weave than a lot of other Ida cloth. And so the holes are a lot bigger. It's great for beginners because you can see your hand underneath the fabric as you're working. It's a lot easier to see where that needle's going to be coming up through. I always say it's great for little kids to stitch on that fabric if you don't want them stitching on like the plastic Ida, if they want to stitch on actual cloth. Because you can see your hand through it, you can see what you're doing, you're a lot less likely to poke yourself. I think it's great for beginners. I also think it's great when you're first learning how to stitch with 2 hands. So when you first get a craft stand like this and you now have one hand permanently underneath your piece and one hand permanently on the top, that's called 2-handed stitching, where you're passing back and forth without moving the one hand up and down the entire time. I think that fabric is also really great for learning how to do that, again, so you're not poking yourself, so you can see what your other hand is doing and where it is. With that said, I do not think the loops and threads fabric is a professional grade fabric. It's definitely hobbyist and beginner fabric. I would never stitch a professional piece or commission piece on that fabric. So if you are stitching with 2 strands on 14 count fabric and it's not looking like mine and you're going, why does mine look so gappy, or why does it look like there's so much more fabric showing behind it? What type of fabric are you using? Is it a looser, more open weave? Are the holes a lot bigger on the fabric that you are stitching on than what I'm stitching on? Because the holes are so small, the floss itself is giving more coverage on the piece. So you're seeing more of the actual color of the floss on my pieces. With that said, there are some times where you might want to stitch with only a single strand. And we will get to that when we cover our back stitching and our black work, where people typically only stitch with 1 or maybe 2 strands of thread for those portions of a piece. I actually have a piece that I'm working on a series of pieces from another cross stitch designer where the back stitching is done in black and white. So parts of it are black and parts of it are white for the back stitching. And parts of it are done with a single strand and parts of it are done with 2 strands. And the result is that it looks like the piece has been sketched. It looks like somebody has inked the piece over, so some of the lines are thicker and some of the lines are thinner, and it gives it a much more realistic, like almost like it's been drawn, or it was watercolor painted and then somebody inked over it type of look. So like I said, knowing how to stitch with all of the different amounts of thread can help you achieve different looks and can allow you to play with texture and break the rules when you feel like breaking the rules, or follow the rules when you know you want your piece to look a certain way. I hope that today's video was informative and fun and easy. I hope that today's was easy for you. With that said, next time we are going to jump over to our left-hand column over here where we're going to be talking about color blending. We're going to cover a couple different methods of color blending and why you might want to choose one over the other. And that's going to be what we're going to be diving into next time. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me today and learning how to cross stitch. If you would like to connect outside of YouTube, I do live streams on TikTok and Twitch on Wednesdays and Sundays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you would like to come and hang out, you are always welcome to come and ask questions and get more information. If you need help with any of this, if you have any further questions as you're going through the tutorial series, you can always leave comments. You can join the live streams, or you can come and join my Discord, where you can also ask questions, and I'm more than happy to help as best I can. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye!